Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Stay Healthy at Home webinar series. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As usual, I will give everybody just a couple seconds to get settled in and ready for the webinar. Thank you all so much for being here for another installment of the New Jersey Self-Advocacy Project's Stay Healthy at Home webinar series. My name is Ashley Ritchie, and I'm the director of the New Jersey Self-Advocacy Project, which is a division-funded program of the ARC of New Jersey. We're so grateful to have you here this afternoon. Just as a reminder, any questions, comments, or feedback are welcome. You can share those in the Questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel. So you should see a tab that reads Questions. Click on that little triangle next to Questions, and it will drop down a box for you to type any questions or feedback that you have. We will dedicate a few minutes at the end of this presentation to question and answer. So if we don't address your question during the presentation, there will be time at the end. We also ask that you complete a brief 2-question survey that will pop up at the conclusion of this webinar. 2 questions, just wanting to know how you felt about today's topic and any suggestions that you have for future topics you'd like to see us cover in the Stay Healthy at Home webinar series. So without further ado, I am so delighted to introduce our guest presenter today, Joan Hanawi with Lyft. I'd like to share a little bit about Joan before we turn it over to her. Joan Hanawi cares about people. At the moment, she's focused on making sure the tech world is infused with humanity through her role on the social impact team at Lyft. In this role, Joan has the privilege of finding ways to channel transportation as a force for good. Before life at Lyft, Joan spent time advising some of the top tech and Fortune 500 companies as a social impact consultant through her tenure at Good. She's compassionate about global development and philanthropy, and when she's not at the office, you can find her at the beach or searching for the perfect chocolate chip cookie. Thank you so much, Joan, for joining us here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ashley, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you to everyone who's taken some time out of their day to join and listen in. I think you might have heard from some of my Lyft colleagues before who, or Elise Richards is our representative in New Jersey, and I know she loves the community there at the ARC, so I'm very honored to be here. As Ashley mentioned, my name is Joan Hanawi, and I'm on the social impact team at Lyft. So what we do is we really lead all of our transportation access and equity programs. So today I'm going to take you through a little bit of an overview of all of our work and kind of especially how I'm going to focus really on like what our work was and how our work shifted during COVID to what it is today. And then also a little bit of a look forward into what is actually, what are the biggest things that we're facing right now, especially tied to vaccine access. So I think that the title of today's webinar is really social impact during COVID-19, but I do want to take you through to where we are now at the hopefully tail end of COVID-19 as we push forward on the vaccine access front. And I'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. So if anything comes up, please do feel free to pop them into the question bar. As Ashley mentioned, I will try to keep an eye on that. And Ashley mentioned she'd be helpful in helping flag anything that pops in as well. But I always am a fan of trying to make these as conversational as possible, just to make sure that it's not you just having to listen to me talk for an hour, but I can make sure to address anything that's actually relevant or pertinent or top of mind for you as well. So again, please feel free to use that questions tab. So with that, I'll dive right in. And as I mentioned, wanted to start with just a very high level overview of what LyftUp means and what social impact at Lyft is. So for us, LyftUp is the wrapper for all of our social impact work. And it's the way that we kind of bring together all the different efforts across the company into one cohesive narrative and program. So it's really just signals our comprehensive effort to really make sure that we're giving transportation access to those who need it most. Our philosophy here at Lyft is really to focus in on where transportation can be used, and we see transportation as our superpower. So where can our superpower of transportation be used to make a difference in people's lives? Like, what are those specific moments where transportation is a game changer? And how do we then offer that game-changing superpower of transportation to unlock opportunities for people in their lives? And the way that we do this really involves the entire ecosystem, involves community partners, involves our riders, drivers, and our broader community. And that's where we really spend a lot of our time thinking about where discounted or free, fully free rides can help make a difference for those individuals and families who lack transportation. So to kind of dive a little bit deeper into the ecosystem, I think there's three big pillars here around how these programs come to life. So I think the simplest form of understanding LyftUp is, cool, how do I get a free promo code or a free ride basically through, and I just realized I think my slides have not been running, so I apologize for that. Let me back up just 2 quick slides so that you guys can see. So you didn't miss much, but don't worry. So LyftUp overview, just kind of the wrapper for LyftUp and what that means. So again, our comprehensive effort to expand transportation access, and how we do it is really leveraging our ecosystem. And so our ecosystem here, really our 3 pillars are around our nonprofit partners, our drivers, and our riders. And I apologize again for the delay on the slides. So for us, one of the most simplest ways to think about transportation access and how Lyft can give that to people is obviously through our promo codes and a Lyft code. So the same way that you would get a promo code from a marketing campaign or something like that and pop it into your Lyft app, that's the same technology that we use to offer free rides to our community, but we just tailor that a bit more and customize it to the needs of communities. But the way that gets out, because obviously if we were to put out a mass call around our ride codes to the general public, we're not then able to ensure that it's going to the people who need it most. And so that's where our nonprofit partners are really critical. And we have a network of over 700 partners at this point, both at the very hyper local level to the massive national, big household name nonprofit level. And we value each and every one of them, and they bring such different qualities and characteristics to the table. But these nonprofit partners are critical because they are our boots on the ground. They are the ones who actually operationalize the program and help make sure that those ride codes we just talked about, or those ride credits, are distributed to the individuals and families in need. We have such a strong community approach to the way that we work, where we don't want to pretend or even give off the semblance that us at Lyft know what's best for the local communities. Like, that's where our nonprofit partners are our experts and our leaders, and they are really the ones who inform us and let us know, one, what the community needs, but then second, who in the community needs this. And so if there are limited resources, or we do need to make a targeted approach to something, how can we make sure that those highest need individuals are getting the support they need first before we start opening it up to serve broader members of the larger community? So that's really where our nonprofit partners come into play. And I think one of the areas that you'll see me talk about in a bit is, one of the challenges there is that it isn't a direct to consumer public offer, right? So sometimes when we announce new programs, it's something where the one of the biggest pieces of feedback we've gotten is how do I access this? And it's not as simple as just calling the nonprofits who are listed, obviously, as you all know, and in the nonprofit community, that a lot of times you're already at capacity. So we've been experimenting with a few ways to put screening questions into place to offer this more broadly and to still leverage our nonprofit partners. But that's something I'll get into. I just wanted to comment on that because I know that that's a question we often get, which is, what's that model? How does it work? So there are, I would say the 2 to 3 models we have right now are, one, when we give rides directly to a nonprofit and they distribute directly to their community members, meaning that there's nothing available to the general public. So it's very targeted. We select those nonprofit partners very strategically. The other model is when we have a broader more direct to consumer facing experience, where someone can kind of go through a screening process to see what's available. And then I would say, like, at the very opposite end of the spectrum is when we do run a full spectrum broad public campaign, where it is something that we're offering to the entire public. And I'll kind of take you through different examples of that, but really wanted to drill down into exactly how we leverage nonprofit partners in the LyftUp ecosystem. the next puzzle piece here is our drivers, and the Lyft drivers are absolutely like critical members, and they're imperative to making these programs work, because the people who actually offer the rides are our drivers. And one of the things that we really love about this model and why we lean into our superpower of transportation is because we, similar to how you'll hear a lot of people talk about a double bottom line, we feel very similarly about how we can kind of feed two birds with one stone here, where not only can we support a community member, but we can also create an earning opportunity for a driver, because these rides are fully paid. So while the rider or the consumer sees this as a discounted or free ride, that means that Lyft is covering the cost for the ride, so that driver is still fully paid. And that's really important to us, to make sure that Lyft is still an earning opportunity for those that are on our platform. And then I would say the last pillar of this is our writers. And one thing that I love about the Lyft community, and again, evidenced by the amazing group that's here, is like we just have a community of writers who are so eager to be socially active, to step up and support when and where they can. So we've actually had quite a few inquiries from writers saying, I love what you're doing, how can I help? Which is one of the best kind of questions and challenges to get when you're on this side of the table, because it's just really encouraging to see that we have a community that also wants to do what they can for others in need. So one of the ways that we've been able to leverage that is a tool in our app called Roundup and Donate. So anyone can opt into this, and it basically rounds up the difference in your fare and donates that to one of the nonprofit partners that you can select from the app. So for example, if your ride was $5.80, then, and you were opted in to round up and donate, then that 20 cents would be, so you would end up paying $6, and that 20 cents would end up getting donated to a nonprofit partner of your choice. We have an array of partners in our app right now. I think everything from the ACLU to Goodwill and United Way. So there's, and they often tie to the programs that I'll talk through in a bit. And I think to date writers have generously, through their spare change, donated over $20 million to our nonprofit partners. So it's just an incredible way to kind of really make this whole ecosystem self-sustainant as well, where our nonprofit partners are the ones boots on the ground, our drivers are the ones giving the rides, our writers are rounding up, and those funds that are rounding up are going back to many of those same nonprofit partners who are helping to execute the programs in the first place. So this is something that that's why we've really tried to build this ecosystem in a way that where all the pieces intersect and really support one another. Moving on from just kind of the pieces of who's in our LyftUp network, I wanted to make sure we also talked about the goals and like why we do social impact. And so there's really two ways that we think about this, which is, I mean, knowing that Lyft is a company, there are also, people often ask us like, okay, how do the business metrics and how do the business goals tie into your social impact goals? And you heard me mention this earlier. There's, in the social impact space, a lot of people talk about this double bottom line of like, how can you achieve social and business goals at the same time? And that's very much so how we think. Like, we don't think it has to be an either or. We think it's an and. And I'm hopeful that our model helps prove that this is possible. So first and foremost, I do want to be clear that like we do look at social impact metrics. Those are the goals for when we define a program, when we develop or design a new program. We are constantly thinking about how does this serve the individuals in need and how does it leverage our superpower of transportation. So under the social impact section, you've seen that I've outlined two different types of outputs or like of outcomes. Sorry, I'm using the words that I don't want to use yet, but the types of metrics or measurements. So the outputs are the very short term, very easy to track. Just kind of the numbers that come as a natural result of our program. So the number of rides provided, meals delivered, people served. Like, we can run a report and see how many people took rides tied to a certain program. Super easy to capture, and also gives us direct visibility into what the program accomplished or did, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about these outcomes, which are longer term. And outcomes are really where I get excited, because to me, the outputs are great, and I'm always happy when we are able to achieve certain goals or metrics. But what I'm more interested in is like, did us hitting those numbers actually lead to a meaningful change in the community, or did it lead to a meaningful change toward a social challenge that we're working toward? And so again, you'll see through the programs that I take you through later, some of the programs around jobs access, some of them are around grocery access. How does our intervention for transportation at a certain point actually contribute to people retaining their jobs, or voter turnout, to grocery access and food security? And so these are the outcomes, I will be very clear, are harder to measure. So given that social impact at Lyft is only about 3 years old, which is crazy to think about, but rideshare in itself has been around for less than a decade. So we are actually right at the point in our programming life cycle where we're trying to set up much more robust research studies to actually get at those more granular outcomes. We now have a few years of the outputs, but we need to combine those outputs with a bit more analysis, a bit more depth to get at the outcomes. And we've had a few preliminary pilots that are showing promising results. So I'm hopeful, and we do hear a lot from the qualitative and anecdotal side of how transportation plays a meaningful role in people's lives. So that is something that we are hopeful to have more on in the next few years. On the other side of the slide is the business impact. And so, like I said, while we do focus on the social impact metrics, and that's what often drives the design of the program, I would say the details of the program are often constructed with these different stakeholder groups in mind. So I've listed kind of the key stakeholders here, which ranges from policymakers, riders, drivers, employees, business clients, and investors. And I think the important thing here is I think a lot of people will think about our riders, drivers, and employees when they're talking about like who is the company stakeholders. For us, our riders and drivers are the two sides of the platform and the two sides of who our consumers are, for better or worse. And the employees are obviously the employee base. But thinking about policymakers, business clients, investors, that also helps us achieve that business impact and make sure that social impact is something that's constructed strategically and also done so in a way where it does allow us to hit that double bottom line and to make sure that we are achieving both social and business goals when it comes to how our programs are constructed and who they serve. So I just think that this, we've heard a lot that this nuance is very helpful to understand how we build these programs. And sometimes we get asked, like, what do you prioritize? And I think that they're so intertwined, and they've intentionally been designed to be intertwined so that we're not thinking about any of these in a silo, because I think that that's where things get a little bit tricky when anyone tries to do any of their work in a silo without the context or without the integration from other aspects of the business or other aspects of the community. And so that's something we always seek to do, is to be informed by the community, informed by the business, to make the best decisions we can for how our programs then run. Next, I do want to take you through our actual programs. And so specifically, this slide is called pre-COVID, because while our programs did not change dramatically, there were changes to them. So I would say if you had asked me at the end of 2019 going into 2020, like, what will you be focusing on and kind of what's the foundation for your work, I would have taken you through these exactly. And so I will walk you through how these programs developed and exactly what they were targeted to address. And then you'll see me kind of shift and talk through what this looks like kind of post-COVID, or during COVID, and what are those adaptations we made. And so as you can see here, from grocery, jobs, voting, disaster response, bike share, like all of these are designed around what is a specific moment in time when transportation would be a pain point for someone and where transportation could make a difference. And then we've zeroed in on a very specific aspect of that, because obviously something like grocery access or disaster response can cover a broad swath of items, but we try to be very specific and targeted to make sure, again, that our impact is going as far as possible. So I'll start off in the order that I just shared them. By grocery access is one of our programs that is targeted at providing discounted rides to healthy food. So a lot of times what we've learned is about 23.5 million people, I think, are deemed food insecure by USDA, and it's very often that food deserts overlap with transportation deserts, meaning that if you are someone who lives in an area without reliable access to a grocery store with fresh produce or healthy food, then you are likely also someone who lives in an area that is not well served by transit, meaning you're even more unlikely to go out of your way to get access to healthy food, which means that people in food deserts, and then therefore transportation deserts, are often getting their food from corner stores, convenience stores, places where there's a lot of consumer packaged goods, which are great if you need to at least just have something on the table, but not so great if you're trying to also, improve health outcomes and make sure that you're providing a family with nutritious food. So our initial model for grocery access was to get people to food. And so we added this extra layer of how do we make sure that we're also not just getting people to a grocery store in general, but getting them to a grocery store that will actually have fresh produce available, that will give them the option of getting vegetables and fruits if that's of interest. So that was something where in our initial model, it was like, how do we identify those areas where food deserts and transportation deserts overlap? And then how do we get them to grocery stores, farmers markets, food pantries, et cetera, especially targeting an audience that would be able to potentially use their SNAP benefits toward some of those better food options if they were able to go to a better grocery store. Our next program kind of in the arsenal is Jobs Access. And here we really wanted to zero in on kind of like that idea or like all the transportation needs around getting a job. So our Jobs Access program is constructed around the ideas of rides to and from a job training, job interviews, or the first few weeks of work until someone gets their first paycheck and ideally has a little bit more stability to pay for their commuting rides. And so as you'll notice here in Jobs Access, we're trying to look at a contained moment in time where ideally, if someone gets a ride to a job interview and then actually gets that job, they ideally won't be in a position where they will continue to need rides to job interviews. And instead, we're putting them on a path toward economic opportunity, ideally, and ideally upward mobility, where someone can then, that's the first push, that's the first gap that needed to be filled to get someone on the right path. And so in Jobs Access, that's where we work with partners like United Way and Goodwill, who are some of the best employment and workforce development support systems that in the country, and they've been incredible advocates so that they're able to provide wraparound services in addition to just that transportation. Then voting access is probably our most well-known program. And actually, sorry, let me quickly go back. So under grocery access, this is one where, again, talking about the models of like how someone accesses this, grocery access is one of those programs where this is direct to not direct to consumer, but direct to nonprofit. So the nonprofit then identifies members who are part of this program and distributes ride codes to them directly. Jobs Access, same thing. United Way and Goodwill receive those ride codes and then give them to the individuals in their programs and in their networks. But voting access is probably our most well-known program, and it's also our broadest program. So if I'm talking about one end of the spectrum where nonprofits get the ride codes that they distribute to their members, and then the other end where it's available to anyone in the general public. Voting access is on this end where it's available to anyone in the general public. So this was an area where we had been doing some research. The first full national full scope campaign that we ran for this was back in 2018. We had done some get out the vote voting access work for a couple of the years before that, but our first kind of full spectrum national campaign was in 2018 for the midterms. And when we were running that, we had done some research to realize that back in 2016, it's estimated that about 15 million people were registered to vote, but they didn't because they didn't have a way to get to the polls. And after especially hearing that piece, that was where we were like, okay, there's something that we can do here. So we built this program where we offered 50% off rides to the polls for the general population, and then offered fully free rides to nonprofit partners who serve individuals who historically have had a harder time getting to the polls. So groups like National Federation of the Blind, National Urban League, Voto Latino, different groups who really target different communities who have faced difficulties getting to the polls. Those are who helped us distribute those free rides. Then disaster response is actually the program that started it all. So back in 2017, after Hurricane Harvey, that's where a lot of our drivers were the ones who had raised their hands saying like, hey, we want to help. Like, we think that there is something we can do. We're seeing the post-storm devastation and we see people needing to get around. Like, we just want to be on the road. We'll drive for free. Like, how can we make that happen? This is, almost 4 years ago. And so we were at the time, like, this is what really sparked the idea of like, wow, what happens when you leverage the transportation opportunity that Lyft offers with the transportation need that's paired in certain moments. And for disaster response, we then, after a hurricane hits or a wildfire ravages an area, like we have a whole process internally to kind of vet and review road conditions, driver supply, safety conditions, all of that. And then we'll open up ride codes to help people get to services, shelters, hospitals, urgent resources in the aftermath of those situations. And that's where we do have partners like Team Rubicon, World Central Kitchen, who help us do that. And so this is something where like that was, I would say disaster response is one of the first areas where we saw the spark of how can transportation serve people in need during specific moments. And from disaster response, we were then able to scale and grow it out into these other programs I've spoken about. And then I would say the last program to round us out is bike share access, and this is something that was launched, I would say, early of 2020. All the dates and times are blurring together, you know, through the pandemic. But early 2020, we launched a program with LeBron James to offer bike share memberships for Lyft operated systems. So something that a lot of people don't realize or fully kind of put together is that in addition to rideshare, Lyft actually owns and operates bike share and scooter share systems. So those, to be clear, are not nationwide, but they are in major hubs. So like we have bikes in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, in Chicago, in DC, in Boston, New York, Minneapolis, and then we have scooters through a couple of those cities as well as a few others. And so bike share access is actually something that is one of the best ways to provide youth with access to mobility, to get to extracurricular activities, to give them a safe way to get around. And so we have equity passes and equity programs within our bike share programs, which offer discounted or free membership passes to the bike share system. So that's what we were able to offer these one-year memberships to a bunch of the kids in our YMCA programs tied to this. And so the YMCA is obviously our main partner here. And again, this follows that model where it's only open to individuals who are members of the YMCA network or community. And disaster response, again, going back one slide, is one that is open more broadly, and that's something that we'll typically post on our blog or our website. And then similar to reduced fare access to bike share, this is kind of the other arm of what I was just talking about with the bike share program. That there was a specific program with the YMCA to offer free one-year memberships to youth part of the YMCA program. But on top of that, there are also equity access programs that are available through our bike share programs in general. Outside of all of this, one of the programs that we also keep live is community grants, and this is for hyper-local nonprofits. So as you've seen me talk through a couple of the other programs, a lot of the partners we leverage are, since these are national programs, are national partners who have the scale and the reach to allow us to build something that's replicable and scalable in multiple markets. But we know that there's also a ton of hyperlocal partners that have some of the same needs and the same themes, and where transportation support can make a difference. So we do have a community grants programs where it's listed on our website. Anyone can apply. They're reviewed on a quarterly basis, and we're able to then give out small grants, transportation grants, to help hyperlocal communities in need and help them meet any of the transportation gaps that their clients might be facing. So that's kind of where we've landed. We had landed up through early 2020. And then where I want to take you through is how a lot of those programs pivoted or changed, or we tweaked them through COVID-19. And so you'll see a lot of the same, probably same images, but the details are a little bit different, where there were subtle tweaks and subtle changes that we made to make sure that our programs were actually meeting the current needs or meeting the new needs that emerged through the pandemic. So in COVID-19, I think that one of the biggest things we did is we're very specific about use cases and trying to tie things to food access, to jobs access, to voting access, things like that. But during the pandemic, we just knew that there was such a need for, if you're going out, and if you were going out of the house, you're probably going for a critical service, which is tied to a lot of the programs I just talked through. But how can we broaden that scope just a little bit to make this a little bit easier and a little bit more accessible for folks, since things were kind of thrown topsy-turvy through COVID-19. So for COVID-19, we had actually activated, like I mentioned earlier, we have a network of over 700 partners. We activated that same network to provide free rides and help transport supplies to people who needed them most. The biggest thing throughout COVID-19 was also expanding the kind of reach of our community grants program. So I think that we typically only look at those and review and grant them out quarterly, but we kind of open them up and we're trying to look at them more regularly to see like what needs are there, how can we support, and granted, Lyft does not have endless resources either, but what can we do to make sure that those limited resources we have are targeted to go as far as possible. And so during COVID-19, there was a lot of activity at the hyper-local level versus at the national level, because it was in those hyper-local community areas and groups that we were seeing the most need. One of the things that I actually loved during the pivots that we had to do was around how we leverage our bike share programs. So as I mentioned earlier, there were some we have a bike share and scooter system, and that this is it's in most of our major markets, but it was something where our equity passes have been made available to community members in need, or to youth programs tied to the YMCA. But during the pandemic, one of the biggest needs was for essential workers who still had to get to their jobs every day. There's they were not exempt from, or not able to work from home and stay home. And so a lot of these were healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, as well as frontline retail workers and things like that. And one of the things that we did was we stood up this critical workforce pass. And so it was modeled after the bike share passes and the equity passes I had just mentioned. But one of the things that was absolutely incredible is that biking and scooting is actually a very socially distanced way to travel. So it gave folks a lot of flexibility, in line with versus public transit. And we heard all the different kind of conglomerations of how people felt about traveling during the pandemic, where some people still had safety concerns about traveling in Lyft, but they still felt Lyft was safer than public transit. But one of the like absolute safest ways, where you're outdoors, you're not in an enclosed space, you can stay far apart from people, is if you're on a bike or scooter. So offering those free bike memberships and free scooter memberships to essential workers in those key markets where we did have bikes and scooters available was one of the most meaningful ways I think we were able to support essential workers. And by the end of the year, I think we had tallied over 900,000 trips, and I think we actually just passed the 1 million trips mark earlier this year. So it's been a lot of activity there, and something that I'm just glad we were able to support our community in that way. For grocery access, you heard me talk a lot about getting people to food and getting people out of their transportation deserts, out of their food deserts, to a grocery store where they're able to purchase healthy food. But in the pandemic, obviously, a lot of people weren't able to leave their homes, or people who were higher risk, or people who might be more food insecure had less stability in also even getting to that store. So we actually, for the first time, were able to stand up delivery programs. And for a long time, Lyft has only been hyper-focused on transportation and ground transportation, so moving people around. But I think through the pandemic, we just saw an exorbitant need, and also saw another opportunity, again, not only just to think of the end rider or the end consumer, but also our drivers, and how can we think about giving them additional earning opportunities. So we were able to kind of creatively think through a couple options to stand up delivery programs. And we did these in hyper-local areas, again, across the country. But at the end of the year, we had supported over 2 million meals for kids and seniors across the country, which was absolutely incredible, knowing that like our teams were basically working overnight to pivot and make sure that we have this functionality available to serve more people. And so I think moving forward, the delivery model will look a little bit different than what you see from some of the other app-based companies, but it's something that was a great learning for us, in a way that we were able to not just get people to food, but also get food to people. Similarly, for jobs access, as I mentioned before, this is something where we focus on the job interviews, rights to job interviews, rights to job trainings, or rights to the first few weeks of work until someone gets their first paycheck. And another huge need that we saw during the pandemic was not just around food. I think the first big push was around food, right? When, local shutdowns started to happen, shelter-in-place orders went into effect. But then I would say that the next big kind of need that we saw was, as people were being asked to stay home, as people were getting furloughed, we saw those unemployment numbers rising and getting only more intense. So when we realized that, we were already in the process of thinking through, how do we make our jobs access program more accessible? And so what I mean by that is, again, thinking about those models of distribution. So instead of it just being, it goes to Goodwill United Way and it's only to people in their community, there's no public sign up, we knew that the needs here around unemployment would be astronomical. So how do we open this up to also not only just reduce the burden on United Way and Goodwill, but to also make this more available to people who are hearing us talk about this program, but need a way to plug in and figure out how they can get that support. So what we did was we actually launched a jobs access hub. And so that's a fancy way of saying we launched a new page on our website. And on this, on the website, we've actually been able to integrate kind of a screening form. So people can kind of go through this form, self-select, answer some questions to understand, like, do you have programming in my area? And if so, am I eligible? So then if they are eligible, then they're directed to United Way and Goodwill to still go through a final round of screening and just support services that are the standard operating procedure for United Way and Goodwill. but it also offered us an option to give people a way to get a more direct answer and a clearer answer. And so we went ahead and relaunched this, or kind of launched this revamped hub middle of last year, which was kind of right in line when things were starting to open up a little bit more, like different areas were trying to get called back. And so wanted to make sure that we could meet the moment of rising unemployment numbers and rising needs emerging from just the fact of people being forced to stay at home and shelter in place. Outside of this, the other big thing that happened in 2020 was obviously a presidential election. So Lyft's policy across voting access is to activate for midterm and federal elections. So so for the presidential, we had obviously been planning to activate here, and we had announced early in 2020, before the pandemic really got bad, that we would be offering rides to the primaries, to the caucuses, and to the actual presidential election in the fall. So we did go ahead and do that, but there was a lot of shifts with how people were voting. There was a big push to vote by mail, and so that was something where we really wanted to partner with our network of partners. Again, the same partners we mentioned earlier: National Federation of the Blind, Urban League, When We All Vote, Voto Latino, Vote.org, like all the voting. We are part of quite a few voting networks, but we really wanted to work together to make sure we were educating people on how to vote, how to make a plan to vote, including if that means you're voting early, and if you are planning to vote in person, how can we get you there in a way that where you feel comfortable when your form of transportation, and also where that cost of transportation isn't a barrier for you. So we did the same model where we offered free rides to our nonprofit partners who serve communities who are historically have a harder time getting to the polls. And then we also offered 50% off to the general public. And the two things we did to make it easier this year are, because we had to remove shared rides from our platform, which are a more affordable option. Just obviously during the pandemic, it just doesn't make sense to share a ride with a stranger just yet. So we increased the cap. So it was 50% off to $10, 50% off up to $10. And we also made the code publicly available on our website. So before, you also had to go through screening questions to get to the final code, but this time we were able to just give one single code to make it super simple for folks to sign up and leverage that. And it was, I mean, across the board, I don't think it was just Lyft, but we saw just crazy numbers from the 2020 presidential election results. I think voter turnout was the highest it's been since 1900. And so even with that, we were astounded to see that we still saw hundreds of thousands of people access rides to the polls, for both on election day and for early voting. And I think that this number actually ended up being double the amount of rides we did in 2018 for the midterm election. So there was a lot of activity here, and we were really grateful that we were able to support some of the transportation needs tied to voting access in 2020. I would say the other big moment that kind of came to be in 2020 was a lot of the reckoning around racial equity. I think just really having a couple moments with the murder of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, of so many others, where there was a reckoning that could not be ignored. And unfortunately, kind of jumping ahead to today, it's still continuing with the AAPI community as well. So during 2020, this is an area where we really felt the need to stand up. And I just realized that my logos are out of date on this slide, so I apologize. But Urban League, thankfully, is still one of the core members of our racial equity work. But we also convened something that we called the Access Alliance in 2020. And I think that an important nuance here is that, as you've heard, we've always focused on transportation as a superpower, and how can we focus that on the individuals who need it most. And the reason why we actually focus our programs on use cases, things like a ride to the grocery store or a ride to the job interview, is because we serve an array of communities. We don't focus on just one or just two. We try to serve all of the communities in need, and many of those are communities of color. So a lot of our foundational partners for these programs have historically served communities of color, and communities of color have been a core part of defining our racial equity strategy, and how that comes to pass, and how that comes to manifest in our program. So we have longstanding partners with groups like National Urban League, NAACP, National Action Network, Black Women's Roundtable, as well as LULAC, U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Hispanic Federation, OCA, Asian American Pacific Advocates, National Asian Pacific American Center on Aging, like just an array of partners who really serve such a diverse range of communities. And it's not just communities of color, but as you all know, it's individuals with disabilities. So again, like National Federation of the Blind, National Disability Rights Network, the ARC here in New Jersey. And so just making sure that these multiple communities and these intersections of identities are represented in the programs we do was critical. And so the Access Alliance was really our way of saying, we know that this is a unique moment where there's a little bit of a fever pitch, and we've included you in this programming to date. How do we make sure that we don't just stick with the status quo, but that we're continuing to reevaluate and push on what we've developed and make sure that it is actually what is absolutely best for our communities of color? So that's kind of the idea and the spirit behind it. But racial equity has always been core to our strategies and will continue to be. And we just want to make sure that we're continuing to put that ear to the ground and listen to the voices directly to make sure that our work is built in the right way. So that kind of takes me through the 2020 pivots that we made for COVID-19. So looking ahead to 2021, I do want to show you kind of where we landed and what we're prioritizing as we look forward to this year, and kind of start to think about what continued needs are there from the COVID-19 pandemic. And as the world thaws a little bit, kind of what will that look like to return to more standard programming? And what are the considerations? Like, is there even a change that like needs to be made? Like, are there the adaptations that we've made for COVID-19? Do we need to stick to those as the new normal for a continued time being until we consider kind of bringing things back to where they were, and all of that good stuff? So these are all the questions we're thinking about. And for us, the 2021 goals are really, as I was starting to allude to, number one is just to help rebuild communities. And I think that the same way that we were thinking about where is transportation a game changer, and where the core essentials and like of your essential needs when you're locked at home during a pandemic, but like the essential needs of what does that really strip down to? And it really looks at jobs, food, housing, and vaccinations. So housing is one of the things that has rides to eviction appointments, things like that. That's one of the newer areas that we'll explore. That program does not yet exist, but jobs and food and those continued iterations are obviously one of the first areas that we've been focusing on. And then vaccines, but I will get to vaccines in a little bit, so I'm not going to go too deeply into it now. And then the second goal is also tied to what I was just speaking about on the last slide, which is how do we address inequities that have been caused by systemic racism? And honestly, COVID-19 has only exacerbated a lot of that inequity. So how do we make sure that not only are we helping rebuild our communities, but while we are helping consider rebuilding our communities, we are doing so with a lens of equity to make sure that in this aftermath, when we have the opportunity to again rebuild, we're doing so in a way that allows us to, ideally focus on the communities that have historically been underserved in the past and start to get us toward a bit more parity there. And granted, that's a long road and won't be done overnight, but want to make sure that we are keeping that top of mind as we think through our planning. So the 2021 programs, as you'll see, a familiar slide of circles, but a slightly different breakdown. So again, food and jobs access are top of mind. Racial equity and disaster response are kind of threaded in as well on community grants and service. But one of the big ones that you'll see is not that there's less of a focus on bike share access, but it's seeing that how do we roll bike share access into all of these, and then also bring in a new focus on vaccine access. And that's really focusing on providing rides to and from communities in need and like those eligible populations. So we announced late December, but have been working through all of that. And so I have a section on vaccine access, so I'll get there in a bit, but I just kind of wanted to kind of take you through how pre-COVID programs have not necessarily completely shifted to where we are now, but you'll see those subtle nuances and those subtle changes in what those programs focus on and how we design those programs to meet needs that are more relevant now after the pandemic, or at the tail end of the pandemic. So then jumping ahead to this last section on vaccine access. So like I mentioned, one of the areas that we always focus on is lack of transportation, and where is transportation a barrier? So as we started to hear and see that the vaccine was a very real thing and something that was relevant, possible, that was coming to light, that was the tail end of 2020. And so our teams had started to think about this and started to get some ideas together, because again, we had heard a lot of conversation around how do we make sure that people get the vaccine, and how do we make sure people trust the vaccine? How do we make sure that vaccines are available? But one of the things that we weren't hearing in the conversation is, how do we get people to the vaccine? So great that the vaccine exists. Great that, thank you to all the scientists who, push so hard to make sure that that is available and possible for people to use. But in addition to just creating the vaccine, like, how do we get it out to the point where it's shots in arms? And one of the things that we try to do is, again, just approach this from the same angle of transportation access. So looking at how many people are transportation insecure, and how many rides are going to be needed per person, since at the time, many of the vaccines that were available, I think primarily Moderna and Pfizer, were 2-dose shots, meaning it's not just getting someone to their appointment once, it's getting someone to their appointment twice. And now we have the Johnson & Johnson one, which obviously changes that equation a little bit, but this was something that was what we had used to scope and basically see what's the need here. So the need here was around 60 million rides that would be needed. And this was a conversation that not many people were having at all. So something that we had talked about was trying to pull together a universal vaccine access initiative, and really working to mobilize a coalition of partners to provide 60 million rides to vaccination sites. And so one area that I do want to call out here, which is a slight difference or variation from the rest of our LyftUp programs, is I think that universal vaccine access is something that is so comprehensive, it's so massive, and something that it's like one of the largest vaccine rollouts done in the history of time, that it's not just a LyftUp program, which is our social impact world. It's a Lyft program, and we are trying to leverage every single vertical across the company to help make sure that we can, reach that target of providing the 60 million ride deficit, or meeting the 60 million ride deficit, and supporting the transportation needs to get everyone vaccinated. So there are multiple paths to our 60 million goal, and the reason why I call out that it's a Lyft program, not just LyftUp, is I think we recognize, we need to be able to leverage every tool in our arsenal to make sure that people get transportation. So that includes rides in the consumer app, that includes rides through our Lyft business partners and our Lyft business clients who are providing rides to their employees. That includes our Lyft healthcare teams and our nonprofit communities for LyftUp. So I'll kind of go through those individually, and I'll go from the right of the screen to the left of the screen. So on the consumer app side, of course, that there are hundreds, millions, thousands of consumers, millions of consumers who use the Lyft app and can afford to get a ride on their own. And so how do we make that even easier for them? And how do we, surface features in the app to make it easier to get a vaccination appointment? One of the things that we very recently launched is an official tool called Rides for Others. One of the biggest pain points we were hearing is, like, a lot of our user base, it tends to be in the younger demographic, but they were saying, how do we get my mom, or how do I get my grandmother to her vaccination appointment? She's the one who's eligible, she has an appointment, she doesn't know how to use Lyft. So we made a very easy, like, Rides for Others or send a ride feature. So people, like a family member could call a ride on behalf of someone in their family to get them to their vaccination appointment. So that's kind of the consumer app, and just trying to make it easier for people to use the app, especially if they need it to get to their vaccination appointment. Then something that's not actually listed on this slide, because it is a newer development, is our Lyft business vertical, and seeing a lot of employers who are interested in making sure that they are doing their part for their employees, especially for, again, going back to COVID-19 response, some of the work we had done for frontline workers, and including those retail workers. One of the incredible partners we have is Target, and they have committed to providing rides to their retail employees to get to the vaccination appointments if needed. So leveraging that community. And then obviously in the Lyft healthcare world, Lyft healthcare is probably our vertical that has been the most affected by this in a good way. But our Lyft healthcare world often focus on non-emergency medical transportation, so helping people show up for their doctor's appointments, their checkups, and just making sure they don't miss those appointments. So how do we leverage a lot of those relationships, a lot of that infrastructure, and those just those systems to make sure that if any relationship with health plans, health systems, Medicaid, Medicare, they're able to leverage their insurance provider, their insurance benefit to get them to their vaccination appointment as well. And then finally is where LyftUp and where my team comes back in is, of course, there are also so many people who aren't able to afford a ride or don't have access to a covered benefit through an insurance provider or through an employer or anything like that. So how do we focus on that specific gap in the population where they have no other solution, no other offer or benefit, and how do we make sure that we meet their needs? So I think that this is where we've been focusing on how do we think through again that those different models of, it's one thing for us to say we're supporting so many people engaged in the vaccination appointment, but not have a clear direct to consumer offer. So that's where I think vaccine access is one of the areas where we have leveraged every single model available that I've talked through probably to date, which is also why it's timely that it's at the end of the presentation. But on our Lyft, so about a month ago, we launched on our website. If you go to lyft.com/vaccine-access, this is our landing page for all of our vaccine work. And on the page, there's a get a ride and a fund a ride section. So again, we've been so encouraged by the generosity of our riders. We have folks who have been asking how they can contribute. There is a fund a ride option to kind of pay for the ride of someone else. And that money is not a tax deductible donation, but it is something that does go back into our LyftUp pool, so we can grant it back out to our nonprofit partners. But on the LyftUp side, if you go to our website and click Get a Ride, it takes you again through a screening form where you're able to self-select and basically see where we have programming and if you're eligible for it to help answer those questions. But we also, on top of that, have given a large amount of ride credit out to hyper-local partners to help their individuals get to vaccination appointments. So we're trying to leverage all models where they're distributed directly to not-for-profit partners who just directly distribute to their members, where there's no publicly available component, to what's on our website and what publicly available options do we have for people who do meet that segment where they don't have insurance, they don't have any other resources, and they just need support. And how do we make sure to expand that and bring in other partners to help us expand the work that we're doing there as well? So right now, I think we have about 5 or 6 states listed, and we have more planned to launch in the next few weeks. So I think by April, which lines up nicely with a lot of the eligibility requirements getting unlocked as well, we should have more services available. And that's something that we're just trying to cover from all aspects of Lyft, whether it's LyftUp, Lyft Business, Lyft Healthcare, the consumer app, or more, and making sure that we're doing everything possible to support the transportation needs around the COVID-19 vaccination. And so with that, I know we have about 8 minutes left. So this is my last slide. So you're done listening to me drone on for an hour. But I do want to just save some time to answer any questions. I'm not sure if any have come in. I'm trying to take a peek. I think I see one of there, and I'm so sorry that I just saw this. It was asking me to speak slower, and I did not see it until the very end. So I apologize. But if there are any other questions, or you need me to go back and talk about anything that I went over too quickly, please do let me know, and I'm happy to chat. Or Ashley, I'm happy to hand it back to you as well if there's any closing thoughts.
Thanks so much, Joan. Again, I invite anybody to submit any questions or comments in the questions box now, and we can address those before we wrap up. I just had a couple questions about, oh, there's actually a question from Brian in the chat. What does SNAP, S-N-A-P, stand for?
It's a great question, Brian, and I should know the exact definition of SNAP, but it basically means food stamps. So if anyone is getting food assistance from the government, SNAP and EBT, those are like kind of the two designations that people can get into to get food benefits covered by the government. And that's kind of one of the markers that we also use to understand who, not only are you food insecure, but do you need transportation support? That's one of the kind of markers that we use to review, vet individuals who get into our program.
Great, thank you for that, Joan, and thank you, Brian, for the question. We tend to use a lot of acronyms in the field, so it's always nice to kind of break those down. Yeah, I was wondering, Joan, if you can talk just a little bit more about some of the nonprofit partners that Lyft is working with in terms of disability access and accessibility for riders with intellectual, developmental, and physical disabilities.
Yes, definitely. And so that's where I think you had spoken with my colleagues Elise and Julia at one of your last webinars. But we partner closely with some of our other colleagues internally who do focus specifically on that. You heard me mention National Federation of the Blind. We also work with National Association of the Deaf, National Down Syndrome Society, National Disability Rights Network, and I want to move my screen to pull up the list, but I know I'm presenting, so I want to be mindful of that. But we have an array of others at the hyper local level. And at that level, we have probably dozens of partners that we work with that focus on individuals with all the range of disabilities that you just mentioned, not just physical, not just mental, but also kind of the full spectrum. And so that's where we have a lot at the hyper local level, but at the national level, that's really where we some of the key players that we've worked with to really support their needs and also understand the advocacy needs necessary to make sure that transportation services available through Lyft are accessible.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, well, we have just a couple minutes left. Again, I want to thank you all for being here today for the presentation, and give a special thanks to Joan and the rest of the Lyft team for helping to set up this presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. And again, I'm so sorry that I spoke too quickly and didn't see your note till too late, Erin.
No worries. Again, thank you all for being here today, and we hope you can join us for another installment of the Stay Healthy at Home webinar series. It's every Tuesday from 2 to 3 p.m. So stay tuned. There's going to be a brief survey that will pop up after the webinar concludes. And again, Joan, thanks so much for being here.